Nobody ever thinks about the bad girl, because the bad girls are sad. And everybody thinks about the good girl, because the good girls are glad.
Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we're reading Chapter 10 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. If you like what you hear, hit the like and subscribe button and the notification bell and you'll get notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. How could these new Irish immigrants, themselves poor and despised, become sympathizers with the black slave who was becoming more and more the center of attention, the subject of agitation in the country? Indeed, most working class activists at this time ignored the plight of blacks. Ellie Moore, a New York trade union leader elected to Congress, argued in the House of Representatives against receiving abolitionist petitions. Racist hostility became an easy substitute for class frustration. On the other hand, a white shoemaker wrote in 1848 in the Awl, AWL, the newspaper of Lynn's shoe factory workers, "We are nothing but a standing army that keeps 3 million of our brethren in bondage, living under the shade of Bunker Hill Monument, demanding in the name of humanity our right, and withholding those rights from others because their skin is black? Is it any wonder that God in his righteous anger has punished us by forcing us to drink the bitter cup of degradation?" The anger of the city poor often expressed itself in futile violence over nationality or religion. In New York in 1849, a mob, largely Irish, stormed the fashionable Astor Place Opera House where an English actor, William Charles Macready, was playing Macbeth in competition with an American actor, Edwin Forrest, who was acting the same role in another production. The crowd shouting, burn the damn den of aristocracy," charged, throwing bricks. The militia were called out, and in the violence that followed, about 200 people were killed or injured. Another economic crisis came in 1857. The boom in railroads and manufacturing, the surge of immigration, the increased speculation in stocks and bonds, the stealing, corruption, manipulation led to wild expansion and then crash. By October of that year, 200,000 were unemployed and thousands of recent immigrants crowded into the eastern ports, hoping to work their way back to Europe. The New York Times reported every ship for Liverpool now has all the passengers she can carry, and multitudes are applying to work their passage if they have no money to pay for it. In Newark, New Jersey, a rally of several thousand demanded the city give work to the unemployed, and in New York, 15,000 people met at Tompkins Square in downtown Manhattan. From there they marched to Wall Street and paraded around the stock exchange shouting, "We want work!" That summer, riots occurred in the slum areas of New York. A mob of 500 attacked the police one day with pistols and bricks. There were parades of the unemployed demanding bread and work, looting shops. In November, a crowd occupied City Hall, and the U.S. Marines were brought in to drive them out. You can almost say it was the first Occupy movement. Of the country's workforce of 6 million in 1850, 500,000 were women. 330,000 worked as domestics. 55,000 were teachers. Of the 181,000 women in factories, half worked in textile mills. They organized. Women struck by themselves for the first time in 1825. They were the United Tailoresses of New York, demanding higher wages. In 1828, the first strike of mill women on their own took place in Dover, New Hampshire, when Several hundred women paraded with banners and flags. They shot off gunpowder in protest against new factory rules which charged them for coming late, forbade talking on the job, and required church attendance. Dun dun dun. They were forced to return to the mill, their demands unmet, and their leaders were fired and blacklisted. In Exeter, New Hampshire, women mill workers went on strike, turned out in the language of the day, because the overseer was setting the clocks back to get more time from them. Their strike succeeded in exacting a promise from the company that the overseers would set their watches right. For real. Church attendance? That's just not fair. The Lowell system, in which young girls would go to work in the mills and live in dormitories supervised by matrons, at first seemed beneficent, sociable, a welcome escape from household drudgery or domestic service. Lowell, Massachusetts was the first town created for the textile mill industry. It was named after the wealthy and influential Lowell family. But the dormitories became prison-like, controlled by rules and regulations. The supper, served after the women had risen at 4 in the morning and worked until 7:30 in the evening, often consisted merely of bread and gravy. So the Lowell girls organized. They started their own newspapers. They protested against the weaving rooms, which were poorly lit, badly ventilated, impossibly hot in the summer, damp and cold in the winter. In 1834, a cut in wages led the Lowell women to strike, proclaiming, "Union is power. Our present object is to have union and exertion, and we remain in possession of our own unquestionable rights." But the threat of hiring others to replace them brought them back to work at reduced wages. The leaders were fired. The young women, determined to do better next time, organized a Factory Girls Association, and 1,500 went on strike in 1836 against a raise in boarding house charges. Harriet Hanson was an 11-year-old girl working in the mill. 11-year-old girl. She later recalled, "I worked in a lower room where I had heard the proposed strike fully, if not vehemently, discussed. I had been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempt at oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally I took sides with the strikers. When the day came on which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper room started first, and so many of them left that our mill was at once shut down. Then when the girls in my room stood irresolute, uncertain what to do, I, who began to think they would not go out after all their talk, became impatient and started on ahead, saying with childish bravado, 'I don't care what you do. I am going to turn out, whether anyone else does or not.' And I marched out and was followed by the others. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I have ever been since." It must have been quite a moment. The strikers marched through the streets of Lowell singing. They held out a month, and then their money ran out. They were evicted from the boarding houses, and many of them went back to work. The leaders were fired, including Harriet Hanson's widowed mother, a matron in the boarding house, who was blamed for her child going out on strike. Resistance continued. One mill in Lowell, Herbert Gutman reports, discharged 28 women for such reasons as misconduct, disobedience, impudence, levity, and mutiny. Levity. Tell a joke, you're out of there. I wouldn't last long. Meanwhile, the girls tried to hold on to thoughts about fresh air, the country, a less harried way of life. One of them recalled, "I never cared much for machinery. I could not see into their complications or feel interested in them. In sweet June weather, I would lean far out of the window and try not to hear the unceasing clash of sound inside. In New Hampshire, 500 men and women petitioned the Amaskiag Manufacturing Company not to cut down an elm tree to make space for another mill. They said it was a beautiful and godly tree, representing a time when the yell of the red man and the scream of the eagle were alone heard on the banks of the Merrimack, instead of two giant edifices filled with the buzz of busy and well-remunerated industry. In 1835, 20 mills went on strike to reduce the workday from 13 and a half hours to 11 hours to get cash wages instead of company scrip and to end fines for lateness. Can you imagine working for a company scrip? Like, well, I want to go down to the other store. No. 1,500 children and parents went out on strike, and it lasted 6 weeks. Strike breakers were brought in, and some workers went back to work, but the strikers did win a 12-hour day and 9 hours on Saturday. Oh, joy! They won the right to only work 12 hours a day. That year and the next, there were 140 strikes in the eastern part of the United States. The crisis that followed the 1837 panic stimulated the formation in 1845 of the Female Labor Reform Association in Lowell, which sent thousands of petitions to the Massachusetts legislature asking for a 10-hour day. Finally, the legislature decided to hold public hearings, the first investigation of labor conditions by any governmental body in the country. Eliza Hemingway told the committee of the air thick with smoke from oil lamps burning from sunup and after sundown. Judith Payne told of her sickness due to the work in the mills. But after the committee visited the mills, for which the company prepared by a cleanup job, it reported, "Your committee returned fully satisfied that the order, decorum, and general appearance of things in and around the mills could not be improved by any suggestion of theirs or by any act of the legislature. You're screwed." The report was denounced by the Female Labor Reform Association, of course, and they worked successfully for the committee chairman's defeat at the next election, though they could not vote. But not much was done to change conditions in the mills. In the late 1840s, the New England farm women who worked in the mills began to leave them, and more Irish immigrants took their place. By the way, ladies, the theme song for this episode at the beginning of the episode is called "There's a Little Bit of Bad Girl in Every Good Girl." I picked it especially for this episode. Company towns now grew up around mills in Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, using immigrant workers who signed contracts pledging everyone in the family to work for a year. Boy, my wife be pissed. See, I just got kicked out for telling a joke. Sorry, levity. They lived in slum tenements owned by the company, were paid in scrip, which they could use only at company stores, and were evicted if their work was unsatisfactory. In Paterson, New Jersey, the first of a series of mill strikes was started by children. When the company suddenly put off their dinner hour from noon to 1 p.m., the children marched off their job, their parents cheering them on. They were joined by other working people in the town, carpenters, masons, machinists, who turned the strike into a 10-hour day struggle. After a week, however, with the threat of bringing the militia, the children returned to work, and their leaders were fired. Soon after, trying to prevent more trouble, the company restored the noon dinner hour. How swell of them. How generous. You can have lunch at lunchtime. It's okay. Your kids. It was the shoemakers of Lynn, Massachusetts, a factory town northeast of Boston, who started the largest strike to take place in the United States before the Civil War. Lynn had pioneered in the use of sewing machines in factories, replacing shoemaker artisans. The factory workers in Lynn, who began to organize in the 1830s, later started a militant newspaper, the Awl, A-W-L, mentioned earlier a few minutes ago. In 1844, 4 years before Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto appeared, the Awl wrote, "The division of society into the producing and the non-producing classes, and the fact of the unequal distribution of value between the two, introduces us at once to another distinction, that of capital and labor. Labor now becomes a commodity. Antagonism and opposition of interest is introduced in the community. Capital and labor stand opposed." The economic crisis of 1857 brought the shoe business to a halt, and the workers of Lynn lost their jobs. There was already anger at machine stitching replacing shoemakers. Prices were up, wages were repeatedly cut, and by the fall of 1859, men were earning $3 a week and women were earning $1 a week, working 16 hours a day. Doesn't sound like much, does it? In early 1860, a mass meeting of the newly formed Mechanics Association demanded higher wages. Excuse me. When the manufacturers refused to meet with their committees, the workers called a strike for Washington's birthday. That morning, 3,000 shoemakers met in the Lyceum Hall in Lynn and set up committees of 100 to post the names of scabs, to guard against violence, to make sure shoes would not be sent out to be finished elsewhere. In a few days, shoe workers throughout New England joined the strike. In Natick, Newburyport, Haverhill, Marblehead, and other Massachusetts towns, as well as towns in New Hampshire and Maine. In a week, strikes had begun in all the shoe towns of New England, with mechanics associations in 25 towns and 20,000 shoe workers on strike. Newspapers called it the Revolution at the North. I'm the king of the North! Sorry. The rebellion among the workmen of New England, beginning of the conflict between capital and labor. These are the three things the newspapers called it. I interrupted myself with the bad Jon Snow impression. 1,000 women and 5,000 men marched through the streets of Lynn in a blizzard, carrying banners and American flags. Women, shoebinders, and stitchers joined the strike and held their own mass meeting. A New York Herald reporter wrote of them, "They assail the bosses in a style which reminds one of the amiable females who participated in the first French Revolution." A huge ladies' procession was organized, the women marching through streets high with snowdrifts, carrying signs, "American ladies will not be slaves. Weak in physical strength, but strong in moral courage, we dare battle for the right, shoulder to shoulder with our fathers, husbands, and brothers." It's kind of a long sign. 10 days after that, a procession of 10,000 striking workers, including delegations from Salem, Marblehead, and other towns, men and women, marched through Lynn in what was the greatest demonstration of labor to take place in New England up to that time. Police from Boston and militia were sent in to make sure strikers did not interfere with shipments of shoes to be finished out of state. The strike processions went on, while city grocers and provisions dealers provided food for the strikers. The strikers continued through March with morale high, but by April it was losing force. The manufacturers offered higher wages to bring the strikers back into the factories, but without recognizing the unions, so that workers still had to face the employers as individuals. Most of the shoe workers were native-born Americans. Alan Dawley says in his study of the Lynn strike, that's Dawley, D-A-W-L-E-Y, Dawley. They did not accept the social and political order that kept them in poverty. However much it was praised in American schools, churches, newspapers. In Lynn, he says, articulate activist Irish shoe and leather workers joined Yankees in flatly rejecting the myth of success. Irish and Yankee workers jointly looked for labor candidates when they went to the polls and resisted strike breaking by local police. Trying to understand why this fierce class spirit did not lead to independent revolutionary political action, Dawley concludes that the main reason is that electoral politics drained the energies of the resistors into the channels of the system. Now, even though that was Dawley, I'm going to read that again because that's also a key Howard Zinn teaching. The main reason is that electoral politics drains the energies of the resistors into the channels of the system. It's classic Howard Zinn, even though it came from Dawley. Dawley disputes some historians who have said the high rate of mobility of workers prevented them from organizing in revolutionary ways. He says that while there was a high turnover in Lynn, too, this masked the existence of a virtually permanent minority who played the key role in organizing discontent. He also suggests that mobility helps people see that others are in similar conditions. He thinks the struggle of European workers for political democracy, even while they sought economic equality, made them class conscious. American workers, however, had already gained political democracy in the 1830s, and so their economic battles could be taken over by political parties that blurred class lines. Even this might not have stopped labor militancy and the rise of class consciousness, Dawley says, if not for the fact that an entire generation was sidetracked in the 1860s because of the Civil War. Northern wage earners who rallied to the Union cause became allied with their employers. National issues took over from class issues. At a time when scores of industrial communities like Lynn were seething with resistance to industrialism, national politics were preoccupied with the issues of war and Reconstruction. And on these issues, the political parties took positions, offered choices, obscured the fact that the political system itself and the wealthy classes it represented were responsible for the problems they now offered to solve. Class consciousness was overwhelmed during the Civil War, both North and South, by military and political unity in the crisis of war. That unity was weaned by rhetoric and enforced by arms. It was a war proclaimed as a war for liberty, as is every war. But working people would be attacked by soldiers if they dared to strike. Indians would be massacred in Colorado by the U.S. Army, and those daring to criticize Lincoln's policies would be put in jail without trial. Perhaps 30,000 political prisoners. 30,000 political prisoners. Still, there were signs in both sections of dissent from that unity, anger of poor against rich, rebellion against the dominant political and economic forces. In the North, the war brought high prices for food and the necessities of life. Prices of milk, eggs, cheese were up 60 to 100% for families that had not been able to pay the old prices. One historian described the war situation. Employers were wont to appropriate to themselves all or nearly all of the profits accruing from the higher prices without being willing to grant to the employees a fair share of these profits through the medium of higher wages. So you don't really learn about these times in this way in high school, right? You don't learn about employers and how much they're paying their employees. You just learn names and dates, presidents' names, certain famous names who said, I shall return, or give me liberty, or give me death, and whatever. But you don't learn about this stuff. There were strikes all over the country during the war. The Springfield Republican in 1863 said that the working men of almost every branch of trade have had their strikes within the last few months, and the San Francisco Evening Bulletin said striking for higher wages is now the rage among the working people of San Francisco. As if they're striking for kicks. Unions were being formed as a result of these strikes. Philadelphia shoemakers in 1863 announced that high prices made organization imperative. The headline in Fincher's Trades Review in November 21st, 1863, "The revolution in New York was an exaggeration." That was the headline, "The revolution in New York was an exaggeration, but its list of labor activities was impressive evidence of the hidden resentments of the poor during the war." The upheaval of the laboring masses in New York has startled the capitalists of that city and vicinity. The machinists are making a bold stand. We published their appeal in another column. The city railroad employees struck for higher wages and made the whole population for a few days ride on Shank's mare. The house painters of Brooklyn have taken steps to counteract the attempt of the bosses to reduce their wages. The house carpenters, we are informed, are pretty well out of the woods, and their demands are generally complied with. The safe makers have obtained an increase of wages and are now at work. The lithographic printers are making efforts to secure better pay for their labor. The workmen on the ironclads are yet holding out against the contractors. The contractors. The window shade painters have obtained an advance of 25%. Yay, window shade painters! The horseshoers are fortifying themselves against the evils of money and trade fluctuations. The sash and blind makers are organized and ask their employers for 25% additional. The sugar packers are remodeling their list of prices. The glass cutters demand 15% to raise wages, to present wages, raise wages, whatever. Imperfect as we confessed our list to be, there is enough to convince the reader that the social revolution now working its way through the land must succeed if working men are only true to each other. The stage drivers, to the number of 800, are on strike. The working men of Boston are not behind. In addition to the strike at the Charlestown Navy Yard, the riggers are on strike. At this writing, it is rumored, says the Boston Post, that a general strike is contemplated among the workmen in the iron establishments at South Boston and other parts of the city. The war brought many women into shops and factories, often over the objections of men who saw them driving wage scales down. In New York City, girls sewed umbrellas from 6 in the morning to midnight, earning $3 a week, for which employers deducted the cost of needles and thread. Girls who made cotton shirts received 24 cents for a 12-hour day. In late 1863, New York working women held a mass meeting to find a solution to their problem. A working women's protective union was formed, and there was a strike of women umbrella workers in New York and Brooklyn. In Providence, Rhode Island, a ladies' cigar makers union was organized. Altogether, by 1864, about 200,000 workers, men and women, were in trade unions, forming national unions in some of the trades, putting out labor newspapers. And I'm going to pause it there, put it on hold, whatever. Thank you for joining me. Hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the notification bell, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.